Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Zara and today I am going to be doing my final review in the second apocalypse, and that is my review of the Unholy Consult by R Scott Bakker. I cannot believe my journey has finally come to an end, or at least the first part of my journey has finally come to an end. I started reading these books about this time last year actually, so it's taken me about a year to kind of get through the books. I've been reading them pretty slowly, really enjoying myself, really taking it each day as it comes, each chapter as it comes. And honestly, that is the best way to read these books because they are an experience, it's a journey. You'll learn a lot about yourself, you'll learn a lot about your own level of patience, you'll learn a lot about your own views on a lot of the things that Bakker talks about. And it's been wonderful. And I have to say, you know, when I finished the Unholy Consult, I felt like a part of me had died. I felt like a part of me had just left, and I felt kind of sad that I would never get to experience this world again for the first time. I would never get to experience these characters again for the first time. Some of these characters are some of my favourite characters of all time in the history of my entire reading life. And it felt quite emotional. I felt quite sad, but you know, there's hope that Bakker will come back and do another series in this world, and I cannot wait for the day that he does that. And if anyone ever gets a chance to meet him or speak to him, please let him know that his fan base is very loyal to him and we all want him to just get on with it, because I don't know if I'm going to be able to wait folks for the next iteration of this series, because it was wild. And I have to say, Aspect Emperor specifically really took this whole world to another level. It really took the whole thing and it really upped the stakes. It really kind of exacerbated, exaggerated, made everything feel bigger and more important. And I feel like in Prince of Nothing, it's almost quite small, the world. It feels quite small compared to what we get in Aspect Emperor, and I think that's just because the scale of what Bakker is achieving is much larger. I am planning to do a video on my entire reflections of this entire series, of this entire world, and hoping that will come out probably kind of April, May time once I've digested the series a little bit more. But this specific video is just going to be focusing on the Unholy Consult. It's not really going to be a review at this point. I mean, I think there were certain things that he did really well in this book and there were other things that I liked less in this book, but it's really just going to be my reflections on some of the events that happened. There were quite a lot of things that happened in this book and it was just a wild ride. Full disclosure, there's going to be loads of spoilers in this one, so if you haven't read this book at this point, leave the video because there are lots of spoilers. So let's get started. So the thing about this book to bear in mind is that the actual length of the book is not actually as big as you would think. So this is the size of the book. It's pretty chunky. I mean, if you go to the numbers, it's around about, you know, 620 pages, but it's actually in fact about 400 pages because the glossary is so large, and there's also a little bit at the start where Bakker does his recap. So the actual book itself is quite short, so bear that in mind. I already knew that going into it, so I already had that expectation, but it's a lot shorter than his previous books because we have that mammoth glossary at the end of the book. One of the things that I really loved about this book is the fact that so much is finally come to a head. I mean, I feel like every single book has stakes, but naturally this book, because it's the final one in this specific quartet, really feels like everything is just bubbling and naturally everything has burst at this point. And we're really seeing everything that has culminated come together in this just ridiculous craziness of a last few chapters where everything just kind of goes down. And I'll be honest with you, there were parts where I didn't really know what was going on. There were other parts that I had to reread because I felt like something had happened, but then I didn't really know what had happened. And I feel like this book, in terms of writing style, was probably one of my least favourite in this quartet, because I feel like Bakker took the vagueness to another level, which I don't think needed to happen. So there is one bit where Sorway becomes the White Cloak Warrior and then he gets killed by Kel, and I did not get that. Like on the first read, I did not get that Sorway had been killed, and I did not get that he had become the White Cloak Warrior. It was only until after a few pages later where someone referenced that Sorway had been murdered that I was like, oh, I should probably go back and reread that. I was actually talking to a friend of mine, shout out to Lorne, who's been kind of like my buddy as I've been reading this book, because he's read this entire world and he knows it very well. And so he's always the person that I kind of go to when I need some help to kind of clarify things in my head. And I said to him, I was like, look, am I the only one that missed this? Like, I feel like this is a pretty big thing and I completely missed it. And he was like, no, like, I feel like a lot of people miss this. So don't worry about it. So it's one of those books where even when you're paying attention, because I really do pay attention when I read these books, you will still miss things. And that's why I feel like these books are really made to reread, which I'm absolutely planning to do either next year or the year after that. But like that was one event that I just had no clue that had happened until I'd reread it and realised that is actually what happened. So that was kind of my one main gripe with this book, is that there were certain things that could have been spelled out more for the reader, and not in a way that would have felt dishonest to the books. I feel like these books are generally quite vague so that we can kind of come to our own conclusions. But it just felt unnecessarily vague in this book. Like, that is my main critique. That is my one critique of this story, of this specific book in this entire series. Now, what did I like? I feel like there's a lot of things that happen in this book that I really enjoyed, like plot point wise. I really liked Moengus's storyline at the start of this book. I really liked the fact that, you know, we get a bit more context on him being adopted by Kelhus. I mean, we've been told this prior to this specific book, but I feel like we actually get a sense of that from Moengus himself. There's this sense of like solemnity, a sense of sadness, and I really felt for him. I remember saying to my friend, I was like, look, I actually feel really bad for Moengus, because he doesn't really feel like he belongs in the Kelhus family. He doesn't really have a place with Naya, and he's just kind of there. He's just kind of doing what he can to basically feel like he's a part of something, even though he's not actually a part of that thing. And I felt really bad for him. I felt really, really bad for him. It was really like sad. As a kind of flip side to that, I found the whole Sorwe Moengus thing kind of gross in places. I do really like Sorwe as a character, and I think his guilt and his disgust that he feels because of his actions with Sorwe are fascinating, and I think they're very human. I think he's a very human character in an array of characters who sometimes don't feel very human. That was quite nice to have a character who kind of is like us in this world. I really like Porus's realization that Kelhus is, you know, he's not the person that he thought he was. He's not this prophet. He's not this god that he thought he was. I've always really liked Porus. I mean, I think he was very arrogant in the Prince of Nothing trilogy. I think he has to kind of get a bit of humility in this book, and we see that. I think there's certain scenes with him that were very emotional because he's essentially being tortured. And I like Porus's character. I liked him and Akka, and I liked their kind of teacher-student relationship, and how in some ways the relationship flipped on its head. But I love that there's one particular scene that I'm thinking of. I can't remember what chapter it was in, but it was between him and Kelhus, where he is essentially rationalizing what is happening, and Kelhus essentially punishes him for that. And I thought it was really satisfying to read. It was very cinematic, that scene. I could very easily see two characters on a screen acting out that scene. Another scene that I really loved, this was probably one of my favorite parts of this book, was the parts with Mamara, Esme, and Akka. Such an interesting group of people. I mean, you know, you obviously have Akka and Esme's history, you have Akka and Mamara now, you have Esme and Mamara's history. You know, they're almost in a really weird, twisted way. They're this kind of messed up, dysfunctional family. But Akka has obviously had relationships with both of them, physical relationships with both of them. So it was very jarring, and yet I just feel like they're almost like the beacon of light in this trilogy, the three of them coming together. I loved the scenes between Esme and Mamara. They were so touching. I think Bakker did a really good job of capturing the mother-daughter relationship, the tension that you often have between a mother and a daughter. And I feel like every mother and daughter can speak to that, where you have a little bit of tension. Your mum wants you to do something, the girl wants to do something different. And I think he captures that perfectly. It felt very relatable. It felt very real, human. And I just thought it was executed perfectly. And I loved Akka kind of being the awkward thing that actually kind of joins these two forces together. And I kind of like the fact that Akka is this awkward old guy who joins these two people together in a kind of backwards way. Carrying on the thread with Esme, I really like her relationship, or lack of a relationship, with Kel in this book. We really get to see this sense of disgust and horror at this young boy who I adore, and not because I don't adore him because he's a good person. I adore him because he's honestly the most sick, twisted thing I've ever read in any book that I've ever consumed, or any medium that I've ever consumed. But I'm kind of here for it. Like, I really like seeing that very disturbing kind of individual. And Kel is just, I mean, he's just that. There is nothing redeeming about this person. There is nothing that can make you root for this person aside from the fact that he's just really twisted and really intelligent. And that's kind of why I'm drawn to him. But I do really like that we see Esme's disgust at Kel. I like the scene where she actually hits him, because that to me is the point where everything breaks down. I mean, it's been breaking down for a while, but that's the point where like she physically hits him, and it's like there's no way that this is going to get better at any point in the future. And, you know, he feels alone. You know, he's always screamed after mommy, and he's always had this idea that Esme would always have his back, but now we know he's completely alone, and I'm really curious how that's going to shape up in whatever Bakker writes next. I also really like, on the topic of Akka, the scene between him and Kelhus, and when they reunite, there's almost this guilt that Akka feels, because obviously he taught a lot of what Kelhus knows, and so he feels this deep-seated guilt that he essentially created the monster. But then I love the fact that he has this lack of remorse for Kelhus, he has this lack of support for Kelhus, he hates him. I mean, Kelhus is evil, and Akka is one of the few people who can see through it and fully understands how evil this person is. And it was just super satisfying to see Akka really like stand up to this person that, I don't know, over the last 7 books that I've really come to hate, because I think he's everything that is wrong. And I'll come on to Kelhus a little bit later on, but I just love seeing Akka kind of take it to him, if that makes sense. I really enjoyed it. Like, I really, really, really enjoyed it. On the topic of characters, another character that I'm going to mention is Serwa. I really, really liked her in the last few chapters. I feel like her strength is unmatched. I feel like she really comes into her own by the end of the book. I feel like she was kind of like a side character at the beginning of this quartet, but by the end of it, she's really shaping up to be a really critical part of this story. And I think she's just a really compelling character. I think she feels a sense of disgust that she's a Kelhus, but then she will also do anything that she possibly can to support her family, because family is blood, and she really stands by that. And you know what, I respect that. As much as I hate Kelhus, I totally respect that she's going to stand up for her father, because that is her father. And that to me shows that she's a very honourable woman. She stands by her word, and she's always got her family's back. And I like that. I like that in my characters, even if I disagree with them, even if I dislike the people that they're sticking up for. Last person I'm going to talk about is Kelhus. So I really loved the bits that we had with Kelhus and the other Dunyain, the 5 Dunyain. I love that whole scene. I actually reread that scene like 2 or 3 times, because you have this kind of collective Dunyain who are insanely insidious and powerful, but then you have Kelhus, who's even more insidious and powerful than those 5 people put together. And that goes to show how deeply evil this person is, because I think up until this point you can't fully comprehend, because we don't have another enemy, right? Like, we have his family, but we don't really have someone to compare him to, because he's kind of the center of attention. But then when we see these other Dunyain, you kind of start to see that, oh, there's something really not right here, because he is even more twisted than these other 5 very, very, very powerful Dunyain, and he's over and beyond more evil than them. I just thought it was such an interesting dichotomy between that group and him. I just wish we'd had these other 5 Dunyain come in earlier on in the story, because I would have loved to have seen more interactions between that group and him, because I feel like it just could have led to a more interesting dialogue, which I think Bakker does really well. Bakker does dialogue so well. So much is packed into the meanings of how people speak. And I just would have loved more of that, because that's one of my favourite things about Bakker in general. The other thing that I'll talk about Kelhus is that I think it's so rich that Kel is the one that ends up killing his father, and in such a bizarre way. But I just thought it was super satisfying that it's actually Kel who is the one that ends up trumps by killing Kelhus. I mean, we always had that sense that that would be his desire, given the way that he talks about Kelhus. But I just thought it was super satisfying, and I love how it kind of came full circle, because I'd always had that sense that that would happen. I just didn't know in which way. The last thing that I'm going to mention is related to Kel, and that's how he was the no god all along. I just love that the no god was always invisible to the real gods per se, because they live outside the concept of kind of, you know, time. And I think the foreshadowing from the White Look Warrior was just so fascinating. I think Bakker set it up in such a satisfying way. I love the fact that he kind of turned it on its head, and even though he did foreshadow Kelhus dying, it's not necessarily in the way that we thought it would happen, if that makes sense. So I loved that. I loved that whole scene. Again, it felt very cinematic. It felt very real. I could see it happening on a screen or on a stage even. I loved that whole chapter, the whole chapter where everything basically just went down, and it just felt very cinematic to me. And I've said this many times before, and I'm sure I'll say it many times again, I think Bakker is one of the most cinematic writers I have ever read, where you can literally imagine movies and TV shows being built around the story because it feels so visceral, it feels so real, and I love it. And I'm gonna miss it, honestly. I'm gonna miss it so much. The last thing that I will mention, sorry, I keep saying this is going to be the last thing, but I just keep remembering things. The other last thing that I will mention is I really loved the sense of desolation that we got in Golgotharoth in chapter 18. The death, the destruction. It just feels like there is nothing that can come out of this that is going to go well. And that's why I'm really curious how Bakker ends up doing the next trilogy or quartet or duology or whatever he ends up doing. Because it's like, where do we go from here? Like, Kelhus is no longer around. What happens next? Is there going to be a power struggle? Are there going to be people trying to force themselves as a, you know, as another god? Like, what is going to happen? I don't know. Whatever does happen though, I really hope we get to see Kel as an adult. Like, I really want there to be like a relatively big time jump so that we can see Kel as a grown adult man, and also Mamara and Akka's child as, you know, teenager or a young adult. I just think it would be really fascinating to see the younger guard come in and really take over from the older guard, but also have the older guard there in the kind of background as well, so that we have those kind of Easter eggs. But my gosh, this book was a ride. It was a real ride, and it was a very rewarding one because I feel like I got a lot from this book beyond what I normally get from a typical fantasy book. I feel like this author, R Scott Bakker, has really changed my perception of what is good writing. I do feel like this series is not for everyone. I think a lot of people are not going to enjoy it, mainly because of the writing style, but also because of how dense and philosophical it is. I think it's a very specific type of person who really enjoys and loves that type of stuff. And I think we tend to be in the minority, even though I know Bakker has a lot of fans, but you don't get a lot of philosophical fantasy. And I think there's a reason for that. I think publishers in general think that that doesn't really sell. But part of me is also like, well, this is the stuff that like goes beyond just reading, right? You go beyond just reading it for fun. It actually makes you think outside of the realms of this fantasy world, which is the type of stuff that I love reading and that I eat up, basically. So I gave this one, in terms of rating wise, I gave this one a 4.5/4.75 stars. It's not my favorite of the quartet, but I do quite like the way that he wrapped things up. I think there were some stuff at the end that was a little bit wishy-washy here and there. Like I said at the start of this video, that I think there were certain things that were so vague and so over anybody's head that they didn't need to be like that. They could have just been a bit more obvious and spelled out for the reader. But aside from that, like I really enjoyed it, and I think it was a solid ending to the quartet. So without further ado, I'm going to read a few quotes, as I always do. Not many, I think I've only got 4 that I tabbed this time. So without further ado, let's go. There is a clarity to ancient things that all men seek to emulate. To read about one's forefathers is to read about men who possessed fewer words, and so lived more concentrated lives, following codes that were ruthless for the brute fact of simplicity. He has a real way with words that is just really satisfying to read. Okay, next. Why had she come? It seemed an act of necessity, as natural as water pooling. She simply had no other choice. To be a mother was to migrate between perspectives, to become a vagrant nation, forever pursuing desires, defending interests, and suffering hurts proper to what were, ultimately, other souls. Sometimes those souls reciprocated, but so much was given in the end, so much surrendered and forgotten, that rank injustice was all but assured. This is why I think Bakker writes women really well, actually. Like, a lot of people who read Bakker hate on him for the fact that women get treated really badly, but just because you write it in that way doesn't mean that you're endorsing it. And he's actually said something very similar himself. And I actually think as the books progress, we really get this deep sense of these women and how they've been impacted by the events, and they all have a lot of strength. And that's what I love about the women in his books. Some of the Mamara and Esme are two of my favorite characters, and I really liked Serwa, and I really liked Serwa as well by the end of it. I think he does a really good job of characterizing women, actually. But anyway, third quote. There was a simplicity to things dead, a stillness that was singular for perching within the husk of motion, and it struck her as the most beautiful thing, the immunity. To live was to grind possibility into an endless thread of actualities, to slough moments like a serpent shedding an infinite anguished skin. But to die was to be, to dwell with the ground as ground, an obdurate and impervious extension. Okay, last one. Awe is the heart aimed at all horizons. Awe is how we belong to what beggars our conception. Awe redeems the vacancy of our imperium, lets us hope and hate as our fathers had hoped and hated, to strive for what the honest heart can comprehend. Awe dares souls to swell beyond the horizon, to shrug away the demented iterations, to believe in what cannot be seen. It calls on us to be what we were and what we remain, men who can kill for the tale's sake. And there we have it. That is the end of my first read through of the Second Apocalypse series by R Scott Bakker. I am planning to do a reread next year, if not next year, definitely the year after that. I am thinking of doing it as a read along, so if any folks are interested in joining, let me know down below, and we'll set up a Discord and all of that close to the time. But I love the series. I also just want to say a huge thank you to the Bakker community, the Second Apocalypse community. It's super welcoming. It's really a breath of fresh air to meet so many wonderful people who are really passionate about these books, about philosophy, about fantasy. I think it's definitely got to be one of the most welcoming communities that I've ever got into, and I just want to shout out everyone to making it so welcome, because there's a lot of book communities that are very but this one is one of the warmest out there, and I can't wait to do more videos, speak to more folks, and also reread the series and hopefully read the new series whenever it eventually comes out. So yeah, thanks for watching, folks. Let me know what you think down below. I will be, like I said, I will be doing another video probably April-ish time on just the whole series as a whole. I also want to do that philosophy video that I've been talking about for a while, but it's just going to take me a while to prep. So that at least at a minimum, there'll be another 2 videos this year, but I'm sure I'll find ways to talk about Bakker again. Thanks for watching. Stay safe as always. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.